I'm Robert Macfarlane. I'm a professor of literature and the environmental humanities, and I'm a writer. Welcome to my exp. I've been interested in rivers, in the idea of life, what is alive and what is dead, and how the boundary between life and death is policed and patrolled, what Jacques Rancière calls the partition du sensible. And I've been particularly fascinated by one manifestation of these debates, these struggles, which is the idea of the rights of nature. And this has, like any big idea, it has many roots, many of them going back thousands of years in indigenous communities in particular. But within Western law, within Western rights law, it has a particular beginning, and that is in early 1970s, 1972, a Californian law professor called Christopher Stone proposes to his board property law class, trying to get their attention at the end of a long seminar. He's talking about rights, and then he suddenly says, what if mountains and rivers and forests had rights? And there is immediate response from his students, uproar actually, affront in many ways. And that version of this very old idea in this young form, half a century or so now, has slowly gained momentum and consequence in the world, and particularly in the 21st century. So in 2008, Ecuador became the first nation state to recognize the rights of nature in its constitution. In 2017, the Whanganui River in Aotearoa, New Zealand, had its legal personhood, its legal standing, recognised in a parliamentary act, and a body of guardians was appointed to speak with and to and for the river in debates, legislation going forwards. So these legal milestones have begun to manifest. In 2022, the Mar Menor Lagoon in Spain became the first water body in Europe to have its rights and legal personhood recognised in European legislation. Things are happening, momentum is building, and a great challenge is being mounted in this form to old anthropocentric structures of rights law. In Is a River Alive, I try to ask and imagine what it means, what follows if we conceive of rivers as having lives, as having rights, and as having deaths. And I think it's easy, relatively easy, to imagine a dying river or a dead river. We sort of know what that looks like, and we sort of know what it feels like. I know particularly because I live on chalk, 99 million year old chalk here in Cambridgeshire, and very near my home are springs. There are very few chalk stream rivers in the world, about 280 depending on how you measure them. 85% of those are in England, the rest are in northern France. So I live on a rare kind of river. And I also live in and around a river system that is under sentence of death. Abstraction levels, population growth in the southeast of England, and climate change, global heating, are all conspiring to put the chalk stream network in its entirety under threat of extinction, possibly by 2050. And I see dead chalk streams all around me. They're gone. There's no water to run them. They're ditches. They're overgrown ditches. So even that affront, that recognition that a river system is vulnerable to something like death, I have found enormously troubling, but also enormously animating. And it's become a kind of heuristic as I've travelled around the world talking about rivers, about their rarity, about how our fate has flowed with theirs for so long and will continue to do so. The heuristic is, can you imagine a river dying or a dead river? And the answer is almost always yes. The Australian eco-philosopher and linguist Glenn Albrecht coined a an unforgettable to me term, solastalgia. Solastalgia is like nostalgia, but where nostalgia is the pain of remembering a place or a time from which you have been estranged by distance or the passing of years. Solastalgia is, in Albrecht's definition, the psychic distress that comes from place changing around you to the point of unrecognizability without you having moved anywhere. And he came up with this term after working with communities who were affected by mining in Australia. And he was interviewing people who had seen their home landscapes change beyond recognition by the intervention of mining. And he realized that there was no word for this particular form of distress that they were suffering. I've always been drawn to people, to activists, and activists tend to proliferate where there is crisis. And so one of them, for example, is Bjørnar Nikolaisen, who is a Norwegian anti-oil drilling activist who lives on the Northern Islands, on the island of Andøya, up near Arctic Norway. And Bjørnar was so distressed by what was happening to the land and seascape around him that he fell into a very deep depression. And when I went to travel with him and be with him and see through his eyes, he had kind of re-emerged, energized as an activist, and was fighting against the pain of solastalgia that would come if transformation deepened around him. Over the past few years in particular, I've come to think that hope is a discipline and despair is a luxury. If I take the second of those phrases first, despair is a luxury because, having travelled with the activists, the land and water defenders, who I have, watched their fights, watched the power that they are confronting, I have seen them nevertheless indefatigable and indeed radical in what they imagine might be possible. So for me to despair, having seen their lack of despair, would be a luxury on my part. And hope is a discipline because, on the one hand, hope requires imagining. It requires imagining the world otherwise. And on the other, it requires the organisation, the work, the labour required to realise that world, to build the new in the shell of the old. And just to end with a very hopeful, quick story. Hope, I sometimes say, is the thing with rivers, adapting the Emily Dickinson line, hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul. Because rivers, if you give them a chance, their life pours back. And the most hopeful thing I think that's happened or one of the most hopeful things in the past year or so is the de-damming of the Klamath River in Oregon, California. And that was imagined by a group of tribal nations in the first instance, and then built and built in terms of alliance until it became possible. And 3 massive dams were dismantled it took a quarter of a century, but they came down. And within days of the final dam being dismantled, the first salmon were seen passing the site where the Iron Gate Dam had once stood. And for the first time in a century, migrating salmon were able to reach the headwaters of the Klamath River and spawn. And before the dams went up, the Klamath had been the 3rd biggest salmon run on the Pacific coast. And the watershed, the whole watershed, in under a year since the dams came down, has begun to revive. Hope is the thing with rivers. We are legacy-leaving creatures. We can leave harms as our legacies, or we can leave gifts as our legacies. I have come to think more and more about gift. The gift gives on, says Marcel Mauss in his great study of gift theory, and the idea that things which are non-transactional and requiring proportional recompense is very attractive to me. And the idea of giving not just to people but to the land makes very good sense to me. And when I was travelling down this big river, the Mutakauhipu, the Magpie River in northeastern Quebec, Nitassinan to give it its Innu name, I was given a pouch of tobacco by Rita Mestakosho, an Innu poet and community leader, and she said to me every morning, give a pinch of tobacco to the land and a pinch to the water. And I did so for the 12 days that I was on the river, and it became very, very natural to me. So trying not to sound too pious, I suppose, I write for people, but at some level I'm also writing back to the landscape that has given me so much over the years and continues to do so. I began this big book about rivers, Is a River Alive, actually thinking I was going to write a book about life. Is a river alive was one of three questions, the other two being, can a mountain remember and does a forest think? So pressing at where we draw the boundary between life and not life. And when I travelled this big river in Quebec, Nitassinan, Rita Mestacosha, the Innu poet, said to me that I would be able to ask one question of the river, but that it had to be the right question. If it was the right question, it would be answered by the river. And I came to realise at the very end of that metaphysically and physically very turbulent and demanding journey that the question was the question that had carried me to that point, which was, is a river alive? And that the answer was a tumultuous and resounding yes from the river.